Welcome to the World Philosophy and Religion podcast. On today's episode, we are going to be diving deep into the most pressing issues of today. So in this episode, Dr. Marc Gafni takes a deep dive into some of the really intense political polarizations going on the globe right now, and how we as humanity can actually overcome that polarization by reconnecting through learning the art of conversation. Now, it's not just about learning how to go through the steps of having a good conversation. The true art of the conversation is realizing that conversation actually is the fabric of reality itself. Let me say that again because it's going to sound crazy. Conversation actually is the fabric of reality itself, meaning that in order for anything to manifest into matter, you need to have different parts engaging with each other, having a conversation with each other that holds them in flow with one another. So you have atoms rotating around that are a bunch of little corks inside of them held together in certain ways because they're actually in a relationship with one another. That is what I mean by conversation being within the fabric of reality itself. So it's a deeper way of perceiving the word conversation, but conversation goes all the way to that philosophical depth, but then it comes all the way up to the daily practical level of the fact that you and I, if we want to get along and create a larger whole out of this world and actually learn how to create a more beautiful, thriving global and local situation, we need to learn how to have really good conversations, which the whole situation on planet Earth right now is terrifyingly polarized. We have people on either side fighting at each other rather than learning how to have a real conversation there, but not just a word conversation, a conversation where it's actually truth, heart to heart, honest. What are we creating right now as a humanity? Dr. Marc Gafni is about to dive into all of that, so I hope you enjoy this episode of the World Philosophy and Religion podcast. Peace.
What a gorgeous, crazy delight to be here. It's a crucial time, unlike any other time in the history of the planet. There's never been a moment like this. Of course, that's true about every moment, but it's particularly true now in that we are literally poised between creating the most beautiful, gorgeous, true, possible world that we could ever imagine, that we already know is true, that's already present and waiting to be disclosed, and that is deeply true, and a dystopia. And dystopia means what we've called the meta crisis or the poly crisis, right? A cascading crisis, but all rooted, as we've talked about here, for the last, almost 15 years. We've been talking about it, and we've been talking about it here last 467 weeks, right? This deep sense of existential possibility, utopia, and existential risk to our very existence, which could mean literally the death of humanity, or it could mean the death of our humanity. And we've understood here at the center that what we need to do, that the single overriding imperative, right, in this moment in time is to actually evolve the source code itself, meaning to get off of the desktop. The desktop is important, and the desktop has the daily headlines, and the daily headlines are important. They have unimaginably important, painful and poetic and poignant and powerful and heart-rending and heart-beautiful reports. And all of that deserves attention, but actually we need to get off the desktop and we need to get into the source code, because it's the source code that drives everything. And the source code, which is a technological metaphor, or from an interior perspective, the storyline, the plot line of reality. And we need to discover, rediscover, evolve, edit the plot line itself. And the plot line of reality, its interior plot line, and I mean this not mythopoetically, ontologically, literally, scientifically, the plot line of reality. The very plot line of reality is its story. right? The story that drives it, the narrative arc of reality, the story of value that we live inside is the source code of reality. Change the story, evolve the story in accordance with its own interior plot lines, you change reality. If the story degrades, if we lose access to its own interior plot lines, if we can't find it, if we can't actually locate ourselves within it, and if we can't look at the story within ourselves, reality degrades. Reality actually suicides. When I'm alienated or I dissociate from the plot lines of reality's story, reality collapses. And essentially what's happened in the last 200 years or so is we have both furthered, deepened, in a very beautiful way, certain dimensions of reality's plot lines, but its most essential dimensions, the most essential narrative arc of reality itself has collapsed. And when the narrative arc of reality collapses, then reality collapses. So I want to talk to you today about where we are today. It's a strange and terrible and wondrous and poetic and poignant and heart-rending day all over the world in many different ways. One of the things that happened that's been at the center of attention in parts of the Western world is Charlie Kirk was killed, right? Who was a particular figure deeply involved in a particular drive, a particular attempt to recast, right, the United States in a particular way. And he was an activist, right, recognized, right, by many and in deep conversation all over the world. And his funeral is right now, right? His funeral is actually kind of his, the memorial service is taking place now. And so I want to be aware of that and hold that. And perhaps share with you a story, right? Because, when someone passes and when we have a friend or an opponent, right, an adversary or an ally, we need to stay in conversation. And that's the first principle of the plot line of reality that I want to talk about today, the principle of conversation. And I want to kind of try and open that up. What does it mean to stay in conversation? What is the conversation we're in? Why does conversation matter? And why is it critical to change the conversation, right? Why do we need to evolve the conversation? Why do we need to actually proselytize in the conversation? Why do we need to share the good news in the conversation? Why do we need to share the gospel? The gospel is the good news. Why do we need to share the good news? But the good news is not the postmodernist left good news, and it's not the fundamentalist good news. There's something deeper going on. There's some new conversation. We need to stop the old conversations, conclude them, understand they've gotten us as far as they can, but they can't get us any further. And we need to initiate and invoke an entirely new conversation that actually evolves, A, the way we have conversation, B, evolves the topic of the conversation, the parameters of the conversation. The conversation needs to shift, it needs to change, it needs to deepen. We need to bring new elements into the conversation that were never there before. And so I want to honor conversation. Van Jones, who's a major kind of figure in the left wing of America and the liberal community, wrote, I think it was yesterday, something about Charlie Kirk. And he wrote, the day before Charlie was murdered, he sent me a direct message on X. We'd been sparring publicly, right, over a particular public tragedy, right? And we were denouncing each other, and arguing, in very, very, vociferal terms, right? Challenging each other's arguments, in the most really vociferous terms. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically, He says, Charlie goes on TV after I denounced his comments. He denounces my denunciation. Then he unleashed a fire hose of tweets challenging my argument, the likes of which, I've rarely seen, right? Things were seriously heading off the rails, right? This kind of public argument. And then Charlie did the right thing. This is what Van Jones, this liberal left figure, writes. He says, in the middle of all this, Charlie reached out. He sent me a text. He invited me to come on his show to talk with him. He wrote, hey, Van, I mean it. I'd love to have you on my show. Let's have a respectful conversation about crime and race. I would be a gentleman, as I know you would be as well. We can disagree about the issues agreeably. We can disagree about the issues agreeably. Unfortunately, before I could even respond, Charlie Kirk was killed. Apparently assassinated for the words he'd spoken, though the killer's exact motives are still being investigated. And Van Jones goes on to write, he says, I've taken issue with many of those words, sometimes strongly, meaning the words that Charlie has spoken, but never his right to speak them, never his right to express those views and then go home to his family. That is a sacred American value. And Van Jones, I want to correct you tenderly, my friend, that's not a sacred American value, that's a sacred value. Conversation is a value of cosmos. So, of course, right, I condemned his murder, obviously, immediately, without qualification, in unconditional terms. I want to make this clear, in unconditional terms. That afternoon, I tweeted, today's attack on Charlie Kirk is absolutely horrifying and heartbreaking. He fought with words, not with weapons. There's no place for political violence in our society, and those responsible must swiftly be brought to justice. My prayers are with Charlie, and so are ours, my friends. So are ours. We're with Van Jones, and we're with Charlie. With all of his loved ones, the traumatized students at Utah Valley University, and all those who have been impacted by this senseless act. Right? Political murder is wrong, period. End of story. In fact, writes Van Jones, I'm continuing, Kirk's murder gives us all reason to come back to the table for dialogue. And let me translate that word dialogue for conversation. And that's absolutely right. One more piece. Violence like this should compel people in both parties to turn down the heat, to seek common ground, and look for off-ramps from the vitriol, as Kirk was doing with me the day before he died. But instead, so much of the opposite is happening. People are using his horrific assassination to call for more violence, or justifying murder, calling for civil war, right? Government officials using his killing as an excuse to censor. Whoa, writes Van Jones. That's not the way Charlie Kirk did disagreement. When our public dispute started going sideways, what was Kirk's response? He pushed for more conversation. Right? Does everyone got that? It's a big deal. It's a big deal, right? So conversation. I just want to kind of feel that. I want to expand that. Conversation is a principle of cosmos. Now, it's a principle that is, again, not just a sacred American value, right? And when Van Jones talks about it being a sacred American value, he loses touch, as the postmodern left often does, with this deeper ground of value. There's a universal ground of value, which is inherent to cosmos. And when Charlie says, right, let's disagree in a way that's agreeable, that's absolutely true. That's beautiful. That's true. That's a first requirement of conversation, but conversation's got to go further than that. Conversation's got to go deeper. Conversation has to actually, in a second dimension, there's an intimate conversation which brings us into intimacy, which brings us into contact. And then there's an evolutionary conversation, which actually evolves our intimacy, evolves our worldview. And we need to engage in conversation, which actually changes the game.
Hey, it's me again, and I hope you're enjoying this amazing podcast episode with Dr. Marc Gafni. Now, I would like to tell you about a fantastic opportunity that is happening at this moment in space-time right now. And right now it is 6:03 p.m. Central European Time on September 24th, 2025. This Sunday, September 28th, 2025, Dr. Marc Gafni is running a live 3-week course. It's every Sunday for 2 hours on the wound. What is the wound, you may say? Well, I'll just give a quick share. Back in the day as a kid, I grew up with a mom who's German and dad who's American. They both loved me deeply, and I was so blessed. I was so blessed in so many ways. But one big problem I had was the fact that my mom's whole family lived in Germany, my dad's whole family lived in America. We lived in America, and then we'd go visit Germany every couple of years. And then I would really fall in love with the people over in Germany. Like, I had these uncles that I was just so excited to be around, and I felt so alive and so in love when I was around them, and I just wanted to spend more time with them. And then a couple weeks later, I'd have to fly back to the States, and my heart would be broken. And it's just like a 4-year-old, 2-year-old, 6-year-old me, 10-year-old me. And after doing that a bunch of times, I just kind of shut down my heart. I put up armor, I put up walls, and I didn't want to like feel that or look at that anymore. And pretty much I taught myself at that point that to love deeply, to feel deeply, to experience life deeply is a very dangerous thing to do, is a very painful thing to do. So I shut it all down, I armored it up, and that is what we call a wound. Now, there are 2 ways to deal with the wound. Either you keep it armored up and you just experience your life at a certain level of dullness, or you actually go to your wound, understand and look at the armor that's holding you back from becoming who you want to be, and learn how to work with that, how to slowly open it so that you can start to shine your light more and more into the world. So this course with Dr. Marc Gafni is called The Path of the Wounded Hero. It's called The Path of the Wounded Hero because the hero is the light. The hero is the version of you who steps out of your dullness into your vibrancy and actually shows up every day saying, Haneni, here I am. I'm ready for service. Let me move the way that I am meant to move. Let me be all that I am meant to be. If you're trying to tap into that type of energy, sign up for the Path of the Wounded Hero. You can sign up through the World Philosophy and Religion Academy, which is just a steal. Not only do you get this course, which normally costs $300, but you also get these weekly teachings that Dr. Marc Gafni gives live for free every week on the internet. But then what we do is we make a workshop out of it. So you get a weekly workshop of how to actually integrate the knowledge from the weekly teaching into your daily life. Not only that, but you also get a bi-weekly book club where we're reading some of the most fascinating philosophical and spiritual religious books on the planet right now. You're also going to get to meet an international crew of people who are doing this type of work at our monthly speed friending events. You are also going to get a course, a library of other courses from the Center for World Philosophy and Religion. So there's just so much brilliant content in there, and you can sign up for that for $100 a month. And this first month you will get into this course with Dr. Marc Gafni, The Path of the Wounded Hero. So literally for just $100 you can try out a $300 course plus a bunch of other things. It's pretty much free. This is an amazing time to sign up, so please do that below in the description or in the podcast description if you are listening to this on audio. Sending you much love. Back to Dr. Marc Gafni.
I want to say a couple more things just to kind of just get clear, right? Our position on, right? And that position's got to be clear as day. There is no room for demonization. And no room for demonization here. Okay, my friends? Like, hold for a second. There's no room for demonization. If you want to know, how to distinguish, right, a true, let's say someone's being attacked, right? Is that person being attacked for reasons that are legitimate and that need to be brought to bear? Or is there some ulterior set of motivations that's actually driving the story? And of course, we never have the ability in our public culture to check all the facts, to talk to all the people. That's impossible, right? In other words, our information ecology has broken down. Okay, so what do you do when the information ecology is broken down? You get what I'm saying? I want to give you guys an example, okay? And just go slow. Let's go slow. I want to give you an example. What does it mean by the information ecology, right, has broken down? So I want to give you an example. I was taking a walk. I'm not going to tell you the names of the people. You all know the names. I'm not going to allude to them either. But I was taking a walk with two people. One of them was, one of the most famous authors in the world, probably sold more books than any other single person in the spiritual world, right? And a great person, just a lovely, beautiful, deep, profound person, and someone I consider a dear friend. And we're taking a walk with another person who I actually just spoke to this morning, who is a very, very close friend, really one of my closest, dearest friends. And I've known them both for, a long time, 15 years. And person A looks at us, me and person B, and says, I got to tell you, the Sandy Hook massacre, and this is about 2011 or 12, the Sandy Hook massacre where the children were killed, he says, didn't happen. It was a CIA psyop. It didn't happen. And I'm like, what? Now, I know something about Sandy Hook, right? And the notion that Sandy Hook didn't happen was something that was promoted by Alex Jones in his InfoWars. That is not true. Sandy Hook did happen. Alex Jones had to apologize for it. He was sued, right? Facts were brought to the table, and it actually destroyed his world because of that lie, right? So Sandy Hook absolutely happened. But this is my point. Now stay really close to me. And my heart dropped, and I couldn't sleep after that conversation for 4 or 5 days. And my heart trembles as I share it with you now, because I realized if this friend of mine, who's intelligent and good and who was kind of ahead of the game, it was 15 years ago, and he was deeply connected to different internet rabbit holes, and he was reading on different websites. But if my friend, who was, discerning and a good person and a good heart and well-educated, right, could come to the false conclusion, right, that the Sandy Hook massacre didn't happen, I realized, and again, it was about 2011, 2012, I realized, oh my God. About a year or two before, I realized that existential risk was real. And then I realized, at the very core of existential risk is the information ecology breakdown. The information ecology is broken. So if my friend X couldn't discern, then how do I expect a person, and my friend X has disposable time and education and discernment and resources, how do I expect a person in mid-Europe, middle America, mid-Asia, wherever it is, who's, working day and night, who's got just a small amount of time, right, to gather and ingest information, right? Once they fall into a particular rabbit hole of information and broken information, they will never come out, right? The information ecology is fundamentally broken, right? We're living inside what one philosopher called the simulacrum, right? We're living inside a world in which we literally can't tell what's true. We can't tell, even when we have, by the way, after Charlie Kirk's murder, there were any number of posts of people saying horrific things on both sides of the conversation. And it turned out that X amount of those things were actually deep fakes. Which were put on the web by people that were interested in sowing social chaos and inflaming, right, the conversation for an entire set of agendas. So bracket that problem. The information ecology is broken. The breaking of the information ecology leads to the breaking of conversation. And as we live in a world in which you can live across the street from someone and you can both have a feed, let's say a Facebook feed. Facebook now has become Meta, right? Although they haven't quite gone Meta, right? And you can have a Facebook feed and neither of you have not just the same feed, but there's not one common item in your feeds, right? So instead of being in the 60s, 70s, 80s, everyone's looking at like one of four stations, and there's some shared conversation, whether you're in Holland or Belgium, right, or the United States or South Africa, right, or New Zealand or Australia. And I know there's people listening from around the world, right, or in Israel, right, or in Gaza, right, wherever you are, right. Instead of having a shared conversation of some kind, Most news is now delivered through the internet, through digital means. People are in particular rabbit holes of information where they have a feed and their neighbor has a feed, and there's not one shared piece of analysis information which views the world in a similar way. In other words, the second dimension of existential risk, which emerges from the information ecology being broken, is the breakdown of conversation or polarization. Polarization means the conversation's broken down. And we demonize the other side. Now stay with me, okay? Stay with me. Stay with me. I'm gonna go slow here for a second, okay? I was in Israel. Living in what's called a settlement. I was right over what's called the Green Line in Israel, which, is the beginning of what's called the West Bank, in what's called the consensus in Israel. In other words, there was a consensus right and left in Israel that without this land, right, the country would disappear, right? So it would not be able to withstand, terrorist onslaught. So everyone kind of agreed that this place needed to stay within Israel. And I had helped build this community, with 10, we went up on a hill and, in the mud and put up 10, what are called caravans, 10 trailers. And it was a very, very kind of tender group of young, beautiful people, young couples, about 7, 8 young couples, no electricity, just a couple of generators. And there was a fierce anger at Israel's political left. One of the key figures in Israel's political left is a man named Yossi Sarid, S-A-R-I-D. Now, stay close, friends. Stay close, okay? Let's just stay close. His name was Yossi Sarid. And Yossi Sarid was kind of persona non grata. And I was there. I was kind of a young, rabbi and, making my way and, speaking Hebrew and, kind of, refused to speak any English and was kind of a, deeply committed to the pluralistic project of Israel as I understood it. And one morning, the newspaper of a particular political party named Moledet was the name, but M-O-L-E-D-E-T, right, which was a far right-wing party, but run by intelligent people. You can have far right-wing parties run by intelligent people. And they had a list of terrorists in the Middle East. And they had 10 names. And the first 9 were known terrorists who had kind of committed known terrorist acts. And then the 10th name was Yossi Sarid. And I'm like, oh my God. This is before Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister of Israel, had been assassinated. I look at this and I'm like, oh my God. And everyone, the 8, 9 couples, and now by then there were 10, 12, said, no, listen, Yossi Sarid, his positions are going to destroy us. And he's done this and said this would cost 50 soldiers to lose their lives. And they go into this entire demonization of Sarid. Now, my kind of livelihood and my kind of standing in the community, was deeply dependent, on, this community succeeding. But there's a certain moment where you just say no. And so I made a phone call to a gentleman named Israel Harel, who was the editor, and anyone who's Israeli, on the call will recognize the names. He was the editor of Nekuda, Nekuda, which was the kind of very intelligent right-wing literary magazine where I had contributed a couple of articles and I had also secured some funding. And I said, Yisrael, I have to publish something. Right. And he said, what are you going to publish? I said, I have to do it. You have to publish. I said, I'm going to publish, right, a little half a page thing, which says that it is Rishut Gumura was the phrase, complete wickedness to call your political adversary, right, a terrorist. You don't get to do that. That's not okay. And he said, no, you don't understand. He said, that ad that you saw, not that ad, that piece was in a very prominent newspaper. If you do that, that's political suicide for you. Everyone's in favor of this party. It's the most popular party. You just got here, right, to the West Bank. You cannot do that. Right? That's like a disaster. And I can't do it on my newspaper. And so I said, Yisrael, I said, you have to do it, and we have to do it. And if we don't do it, and if we don't stand for this, we will have, and these are the words I said, we will have, right, political assassination as part of our discourse, which will change the course of history. He did not want to agree. We fought quite vociferously. In the end, he relented. The piece was published, and it's there on record. I'm in our little settlement. There were no phones. There was just a little ramshack, a little kind of shack in the middle, which had a payphone. And late at night, the day after it's published, the phone starts ringing and ringing off the hook. So I kind of get myself out of bed. I get the phone, right? The payphone, and who is it? It's Yossi Sarid, right? The person who I had written to defend, right, against that attack, who was on the complete opposite side of, right, pretty much everything I thought was correct. We talked, we met, we became friends. We started a conversation. The very last thing I did before I left Israel, the last time I've been in Israel since, but the last time I left Israel kind of from my period of having lived there, right, when I flew to an American speaking tour, I filmed a television show with Yossi, right, on kind of, something about Hebrew wisdom and spirituality, whatever it happened to be. Okay, but hello. Shortly afterwards, Rabin was assassinated. There is no room. There is no room for political violence. Political violence obviously ends the conversation in every possible way. And there cannot be, right, even a smidgen, right, of justification. Van Jones is correct. And I want to honor Charlie Kirk in one way, one sentence. He stayed in the conversation. Right? Whatever else there is to say, I'm not going to spend today and the rest of our time, kind of analyzing Charlie Kirk, his life, the phenomena, right? That's not our point here. Blessings to his soul, blessings to his family, blessings to his two children. But I want to honor him on the day of his funeral in the way that Van Jones honored him, in the way that the Democratic governor of California, Gavin Newsom, honored him. Gavin said, my son told me he follows Charlie, on Instagram. By the way, my son told me the same thing. Neither of our sons, neither Gavin's son or my son, are following the politics, right? They were following as there was something alive, right, in staying in the conversation and being willing to go to campus after campus and engaging the conversation again and again and again. Right? So amen. Amen. Right? Amen. Okay, that's part one. I want to just give you in conclusion, and then I want to go to part two. But I want to give you in conclusion, how do you distinguish? We asked a question, okay? How do you distinguish between, right, a genuine, right, someone's on the web and making posts and, they're pointing to something and they're attacking, right, something which is a genuine issue, a true cause for concern, or someone who's engaged in something entirely differently that's driven by, whatever series of ulterior motivations there might be, by hidden agendas, by facts that are not being revealed, but that's driven by distortion. How can you distinguish between those two? So there's, I would say, three simple ways to distinguish. One, is there a conversation happening? When there's no conversation happening between sides, and the conversation only takes place through social media posts, right, of ad hominem attack, then you can be quite sure that this is not something sacred. When a person leaves or a group of people leave the conversation, they don't engage in conversation. They refuse to engage in conversation, but they use essentially the digital platforms, right, from the safety of that distance, hidden at home, right, behind their screens, an ad hominem attack, refusing to ever engage conversation or to do what Kirk did and reached out to Van Jones and said, let's have a conversation. Let's talk to each other. If a person refuses to engage in face-to-face conversation, sometimes that's mediated conversation. But if we can't engage in face-to-face conversation, sometimes mediated, to adduce evidence for our positions, to engage, to feel each other, right? To actually create direct contact, right? In an environment that's safe, right? Then you can be quite sure, right, that what's going on is not what it seems and needs to be not taken seriously. But I'll give you the second litmus test. It's not just A, if the people who are attacking have stepped out of the conversation. A. B, if they're engaging in demonization. And demonization means you've cast the other as a demon. You've made them, in some sense, subhuman. And to subhumans, to demons, we don't need to accord respect. We don't need to accord dignity. We don't need to converse because you're not supposed to have conversations with demons. Everyone knows that. And one of the methods of demonization, point 3, is that we infantilize ourselves and we ascribe enormous power, right, to the one that we're demonizing. And so that's the second litmus test. And the third litmus test is there a possibility to find higher ground? So if one side of the conversation says, peace can never be made here, there's never a new wholeness that's possible, there's never a new day, right? There's never a resolution, there's never a transformation, but they're actually doing what we call in American literature the Hatfields and the McCoys, right? A perpetual feud. Then you understand that's what's driving this dynamic is not sacred conversation. It's not the conversational cosmos awake at the human level. It's not eros and holiness. What's driving it is some other set of base motivations, which actually don't deserve response. We can't leave the conversation. And I want to just kind of, I can't say that seriously enough, right? We live in a conversational cosmos, and the essence of the conversational cosmos is to stay in the conversation. But that's just part one. It's not enough to stay in the conversation, right? We need to enter into the conversation in a particular way. We need to do something in the conversation. So one, we need to enter in the conversation in a particular way with a particular interior quality, which I want to talk about now just for a second. And then I want to talk about what we need to do in the conversation. And then particularly, I want to look at the time, right? I want to look at a very specific conversation, the conversation taking place today between the left all around the world and fundamentalism, particularly as it's refracted in the United States, but it's playing out in Europe, it's playing out in Asia, it's playing out in Africa, right? It's a worldwide phenomenon. I want to look at that conversation between fundamentalism, right, and between, right, what we'll call postmodernism, the postmodern left. The postmodern left and classical religious fundamentalism, that conversation is driving society, and that conversation is broken down, right? And what Charlie didn't do, and Charlie would appreciate this, right? He'd appreciate it. I'm engaging him in conversation, and I welcome, anyone, from Turning Point USA to come and engage in conversation at any time. So this is with great honor as a person, is being laid to rest. We engage with the greatest of honor. What the fundamentalist conversation didn't do, what the conversations of Turning Point didn't do, is actually listen deeply to what are the truths on the other side. In other words, it's not just that the opposition is wrong, right, or confused or lacking information. That may be true. But is there an intuition? Is there a knowing? Is there a value that your conversational opponent is standing for that you can discern, identify with, and use that to create the next stage of conversation? Okay, now go slow, go slow, go slow. So Charlie's mentor is a man named Dennis. He had a number of mentors, but one of them is a man named Dennis Prager. I know Dennis. He runs something called Prager University, which is an incredibly sophisticated educational conservative outlet. And I disagree with, 60% of what appears on Prager University. Okay, about 60%. About 40%, I think, is important. But about 60% on key issues, right? Kind of on how they tell the story, the worldview I disagree with. So I met Dennis. I had dinner at his house at some point, and I had done his radio show, and we had have a number of mutual friends, and we were in some sense related, and so I said, let's debate, and I did a public debate with Dennis. Right before I took a 2-year hiatus in 2006, we did a public debate, a huge public debate, with about 1,000 people, where we went at it, and it was fierce. It was fierce. I mean, it was fierce. Now, stay with me for a second, okay? And I'm going to give you just a moment, a snippet from the debate, okay? So Dennis had written an article which said, God is not in trees. Okay, you with me, everybody? God is not in trees. And he basically kind of was critiquing, the position of much of the kind of liberal community and, the environmental community, which kind of had identified God with kind of a Gaia, with the natural world. So Dennis writes, God is not in trees. So I came to the debate, and I was in a very tender mode and in a very fierce mode. And I said, Dennis, and this is recorded. I said, Dennis, I'd like to read you a text. And, this text, so I read the text. And the text reads, Eitzim va'avanim elohut mamash. Trees and stones are literal divinity. So, of course, Dennis assumed that must be from some, liberal Protestant or kind of, reform, rabbi, kind of, unfamiliar with the depth of gnosis and the lineage. And I said, and maybe now I'm going to ask everyone, we're going to hold the conversation for a second in the chat box. I'm not tracking the chat box, but we'll bracket for a second and kind of let's all come together now, and then we'll talk afterwards, okay? In this moment in the conversation, let's just find our way kind of inside, just kind of find our way, okay? So sometimes when a person's talking, right, we use that moment when they're talking to formulate what we're going to say. I want to listen to everyone, but for now, I want to just ask everyone, come together. Let's actually kind of find this, right? It's deep and it's beautiful, but we got to kind of find it. So I said to Dennis, the person who wrote these words was a great master, deep within kind of the Orthodox Hebrew wisdom tradition, right? He was, one of the masters of a particular Hasidic dynasty of unimpeachable integrity. And Dennis was like, oh my God. It was like a little bit of an embarrassing moment because Dennis had said that no respectable kind of, wisdom teacher within the kind of Jewish tradition who had real integrity would ever say something like that. And then I cited him, one of the most important masters who was saying precisely that. Now, of course, I understood where Dennis was coming from. What Dennis was trying to express, and what was the value that he was holding. Right? The value that he was holding, which is not incorrect, is that if God is only in nature, but does not transcend nature, is not the source of nature, then we have no capacity to transform our own natures, to control our own natures, right? In other words, if the force of reality is only in the natural world, but does not source and does not transcend the natural world, then I can't actually access the divine point in me to control, direct, and transform my own nature. It's a powerful point, right? It deserves engaging, and there's an enormous amount of truth to it. So we had a fierce contestation. My point's not the content of our conversation, right? It was fierce, and I don't think Dennis has had that intense of an engagement, had not for quite a while. So let me just tell you what Dennis did at the end of the debate, at the end of the public conversation. Again, 1,000 people, his home turf. He came over to me, shook my hand, and he said, "Wow, let's do that again. Let's do that again." Huh? Go Dennis, right? Right? You follow me? In other words, it's a very deep realization we have to have. Because I think Dennis is dead wrong on a number of issues. Okay, but let's get this. The conversation must go on, right? We can step forward, we can step back, we can't look away, right? We can't not engage in the conversation, right? Other than in very, very rare extreme circumstances, right? We don't engage in conversation with Hitler. There's a certain point you break off the conversation when you're talking to Hitler. Okay, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, right, within the context of pluralistic democracy. Okay. That's one. That's point one. We got point one? We're good on point one? Okay. Point two. Point two. Okay, we got a drum roll here? We got a drum roll in the house. Are we awake? Are we alive? Are we good? It's great to be in conversation. It's just, I'm insanely delighted, right, to be here with you. And I'm just crazily honored. Let's drum roll it in. Let's drum roll it in. We are in the conversation. We're in the conversation, but we got to be more than in the conversation. So the first thing is stay in the conversation. That's step one. But stay in the conversation because that's the only way we avoid the existential risk of polarization. And polarization is the direct result of a broken information ecology. Now, I want to talk to you, not right now, but in the coming weeks, about how we overcome this broken information ecology. That's enormously important. I know we haven't addressed that now. I can't do everything in 1 week, but I know that's on the table. But right now we're talking about polarization. So the beginning of overcoming polarization, right, is staying in the conversation. The utter opposite, the destruction of conversation, is Robin's assassination. That is political assassination. It's a horror. Van Jones is correct. Governor Newsom, right, is correct. Okay, so let's just hold that. Two, what is the sayings is the wrong word, a bunch of not really aphorisms, not really epigrams, but kind of reality considerations, reality insights from deep within the lineage of the Solomon lineage. And I want to use this part two, to kind of go to part two, which is, how do I come to the conversation? Who am I when I come to the conversation? Right? And David's going to read the code, or someone's going to read the code when we finish. But part of the code for this week, the evolutionary love code for this week, is we have to be, right, fierce and tender. But our tenderness needs to be quivering tenderness, and our fierceness, right, needs to be trembling. And we need to be tender and fierce at the same time, but we can't leave the tenderness out of the conversation. Fierce combatants, and yet wild beloveds, wild lovers, wild tenderness. So let me, if I can, right, share with you some words from deep within the lineage. So love, number one. I'll give you 4 or 5 sets of kind of Hasidic kind of text, lineage, Solomon lineage texts. Love cannot be taught. Love cannot be taught. All we can hope for is that maybe we can unlearn the hatred, because hatred is taught. Love is the natural state of reality. But it's deeper. That's 1. 2, the question is not how much you love each other. The question is how much you love each other when you hate each other. Does everyone get that? Can we open our hearts? And the question is not how much you love each other, right? The question is how much you love each other when you hate each other. I'm going to say it again. Do you get that? The question is not how much you love each other. The question is how much you love each other when you hate each other. 3, if you love someone, you stay in the conversation. Yeah? If you love someone, never ignore her, never ignore him. When you love someone, it means you exist and they exist. Ignoring someone means, in my book, you don't exist. If you love someone, but in their book you don't exist, that really hurts. It rips your heart out. Right? So I want to take it again. This is the third text. If you love someone, never ignore him, never ignore her. When you love someone, it means you exist. When someone loves you, you're reminded that you exist. Ignoring someone means, in my book, you don't exist. And if you love someone, but in their book, you don't exist, God, does it hurt? Right? Yeah. Number 4. Sometimes you meet a person and you forget about them immediately. Right? Sometimes you meet a person, you forget about them immediately. But when you meet someone who is real, you remember them forever. Can you feel that? Sometimes you meet a person, you forget about them immediately. But when you meet someone who is real, you remember them forever. Part 3 is really where I wanted to get to. But I think we'll do it this way. We'll do part 3 next week, because it's big and it's huge and it's crazy important. But here's what part 3 is about, okay? So we've talked about 1, I have to stay in the conversation. It's a conversational cosmos. I've mentioned before that in the lineage, we point out the Solomon lineage that philologically, right, etymologically, when you look at the word Messiah, which is this vision of the new human, this vision of a new possibility, this vision of the emergence of a new society, a new humanity. What we call the move from Homo sapien to Homo amor, that's called Messiah. And the word Messiah, Mashiach, literally means conversation. So the new human stays in the conversation. Does that make sense? Now stay with me. Stay with me. It gets well. I want to just go a couple of steps. I'm going to end here. I want to just finish this piece from today with this huge piece, which is actually the essence of what I want to talk about today. We'll do next week. And I'll give you, though, a hint of where we're going if I can. But stay with me, okay? So Messiah means, right? Homo amor means, right? The new human means, literally the word means conversation. So the response to polarization is conversation. Now stay close. In the epic lineage story, which has been read more than any other single story in human history, called the Garden of Eden story, which we'll have to spend an entire week or 2 weeks reading this year at some point. But in the Garden of Eden story, there is a question that needs to be asked. And I've offered before, and I'm not going to look at the chat box. I'm going to ask anyone who's discussed this with me before not to write it in the chat box. But there is a center protocol that we have at the Center for World Philosophy and Religion that we offer an enormous amount of money for the right answer to this question, right? Which is, share with us the words that Adam said to the snake in the Garden of Eden text. Share with us the words that Adam said to the snake in the Garden of Eden story. And, although we are in a budget deficit now that we're working to close, I think that we can personally offer $50,000 to anyone who's able to do that. Okay. And I mean that with great gravitas and seriousness. Now, of course, the reason I'm not concerned is because there are no words. Because, stay close, because Adam never talks to the snake in the Garden of Eden. He refuses to enter the conversation. Who talks to the snake? The feminine. Eve. Eve has a conversation with the snake. Now stay close. In the literature of esoteric literary conversation, every letter in the original Hebrew has a numerical value. So the Hebrew word for snake is nachash, the whisperer, nachash. And the word nachash means magic, means the whisperer, means snake. Okay, stay close. And nachash, the gematria, meaning the numerical value of each of the letters, the three letters in this word nachash, nun, chet, shin, the numerical value is 248. And so there's a hidden mystical epigram exchanged between those who know, which is Nachash Gematria Mashiach. The numerical valuation of Nachash, snake, is the same as the numerical valuation of Messiah. So while in the public reading, the snake is the demonized one, the snake is the one who should be killed, right? The snake is the one who should be out of the conversation. Eve understands something. She begins the conversation. She's willing to engage the conversation. And actually, if you read the text carefully, which I won't right now, you realize that the Nachash is wise. He's described as Arum, and Arum means wise and naked. He has a naked heart. He has wisdom. He has depth. He knows something. Now, stay close. In the Garden of Eden story, Adam is exiled from the garden, and Eve is exiled from the garden. Long story, we're not going into it now. The one player in the story who's not exiled from the garden, who remains in the Garden of Eden, is the snake. Stay close. One more step. The description of the snake is, right, or his kind of the results, right? It's understood as a punishment in the public reading of the text. I don't want to go there now, but the punishment, as it were, of the snake for whatever happened in the garden, whatever that story means, whatever that literary story means, the punishment is, right, he no longer is going to have legs. His legs are, as it were, cut off, and he now is on his belly. So the snake had legs before. What's a snake with legs? A dragon, right? A dragon. So St. George, the masculine, takes his sword and he slays the dragon. The feminine has a conversation with the dragon. And it's that conversation which is the Messianic conversation. The snake is actually a dragon. And the dragon has something to say. And in the lineage, there's what's called Derech HaTaninim, the way of the dragon, which is the left-handed path. And in the left-handed path, we actually engage in conversation in an entirely different way in order to actually transform, in order to actually evolve something, to change something, to make something new. So we have to change the conversation. We can only change the conversation by changing the mood of the conversation. We change the mood of the conversation by entering into the conversation as outrageous lovers. We're madly alive. We're madly in love. We're madly in love with reality, right? We can only heal a broken earth, not through environmental action, although we need environmental action, but we heal a broken earth by falling madly in love with the earth, right? We heal a broken conversation by falling madly in love with the people we're talking with. And madly in love means we're outrageous lovers. Outrageous lovers means we hear each other. We can feel and hear the value which we're contesting, even if we disagree vociferously, but we can feel each other, right? We feel, the universe feels, and the universe feels love. And that love moves in me, as me, and through me. And even if my sword is raised in contestation, I love you madly. It's a big deal, right? We live in a world of an outrageous confusion. And outrageous confusion causes outrageous pain. And the outrageous confusion, right, disallows us from even finding our ground. And the only response to that outrageous pain is outrageous love. But outrageous love is discerning. Love is not blind. Love is a perception we discern. So we can't just change the mood. We have to say something new. And I want to end with this. See, conversation's not just, as Charlie said, let's disagree in an agreeable way. That's good, but that's wildly insufficient. Right? If I would sit and talk to Charlie, I would want to say, wow, man, you got 5 serious things massively wrong. And let me share with you why. And if I would sit with a postmodern representative, like, for example, Yuval Harari, who I invited to a conversation, right? I send him direct messages. Before I did the public critique of Yuval's work, I did everything possible I could to invite him to a public conversation, right? And the invitation stands. I would sit with Yuval and I would say, Yuval, man, I love you madly, man. And oh my God, right? When you say something like, any meaning we ascribe to our life is mere delusion, you're destroying something in reality. And I would say to Charlie Kirk or to the evangelical movement, right, when you suggest that the road to heaven is only through a particular path of theology that's literally not available to most human beings on the planet. If you grew up Sunni or Shiite, right, or Jewish, right, or Buddhist or Taoist, right, or Hindu, right, you're definitely not going to engage the particular evangelical path that, according to many, even most evangelical teachers, opens the door to heaven. So, whoa, let's talk about that. Let's get more fundamental than fundamentalism. Let's get more postmodern than postmodernism. Let's actually find what's the deepest value that actually fundamentalism is holding. Let's identify what's the deepest value. Understand what that is. And then follow it to its root and liberate the spark from the broken vessel. Let's understand what's the deepest value that postmodernism is holding, not in its broken form. Follow it to its root, and let's liberate the spark from the broken vessel. When there are broken vessels, we don't demonize the broken vessel. We enter into the darkness, and we liberate the sacred spark from the broken vessel, and we bring those sparks together, and we create a new possibility. We create new verbs, and we create new language, and we create new sentences, right? And we create an entirely new semiotic field, right? That's what we're doing at the center. And that's what this is about. The only way to respond to the meta crisis is not to engage in thought-terminating cliches, meaning to end the conversation. Let me show you why postmodernism is wrong. We should do that. Let me show you why pre-modernity is wrong, even when it's dressed up in modern guise. It's still wrong. It's wrong for these 5 reasons. And here are the deep values that pre-modernity got right, that are unimaginably important. And I want you, my evangelical friend, to understand that the value that moves you moves me, because we both live in the field of value together. And I want my postmodern friend to understand the value that moves you, that drives the animating sacred spark, which is the animating impulse of postmodernity, right, lives in my heart like it lives in yours, just like the animating impulse of evangelical good news gospel lives in my heart. But now I've got to follow that animating spark back to its root. I need to challenge its broken expressions, not just tenderly, but fiercely. You know, the early ecumenical conversation between Christians and Jews in the early 60s led absolutely nowhere. And someone once said that the early ecumenical Christian-Jewish conversation was when Jews who didn't believe in Judaism and got together with Christians who didn't believe in Christianity, and they discovered they had a lot in common. That's not the conversation we need to have. It's not enough just to be agreeable when we disagree. We need to be so tender, quivering with tenderness. And we need to be so fierce and our fierceness and our tenderness need to be inextricable. And we need to feel each other, and we need to love each other. Right? We need to love each other. We need to embrace each other. Everything depends on it. Everything depends on not just being in the conversation, not just not leaving the conversation, not just coming to the conversation as outrageous lovers, but actually evolving the conversation. How do we actually change the conversation? And that's what we're going to talk about next week. And next week might be our most important One Mountain ever. It's going to be, I think, week 468, right? I want to try and identify, with your permission, everyone, I would try and identify, where did the conversation break down? Where did the conversation of evolution break down? Where did evolution begin to meander? Where did the evolution of love stop? What are the blocks? What are the obstacles? Where did the conversation break down? Where does postmodernity break down? Where does premodernity in its evangelical and other forms break down? And then what are we bringing to the conversation? We can't just bring to the conversation a cataloging of the breakdown. That's happening in a number of places. We need to bring actually new structures of insight, of possibility, new distinction that actually change the conversation. And we need to disidentify egoically with those new insights, not use them as an egoic game, but actually use them as Cupid's arrows of love, that we shoot arrows of insight, Manjushri's sword of discernment, that actually allows new possibility, that opens the new door, that responds to the meta crisis and begins to take us home. Wow. So David, maybe give us the code when we go to Krista, and like, oh my God, it's crazy, crazy joy to be back. And oh my God. Cha.
What a pleasure. Wow. The pleasure of evolutionary conversation. There's nothing better than that. So here's our code for this week, which is also setting us up for next week. It's all so tender. It's all so fierce. But tenderness, to be true, must quiver. Fierceness, to be true, must tremble. Reality is tender and fierce all the way up and all the way down the evolutionary chain. Tender and fierce must be the nature of political conversation, of social conversation, of religious conversation, of personal conversation. Conversation is the very nature of reality. We live in a conversational cosmos, all the way up and all the way down the evolutionary chain. Conversation is the essence of intimacy. When conversation dies, intimacy dies. When intimacy dies, the intimate universe deconstructs, falls apart, and goes dark. There are two elements to conversation. First, conversation itself has its own value, irrespective of the outcome. Conversation is an act of intimacy. Conversation is the ultimate erotic act. Second, conversation seeks to transform, to persuade, to proselytize, to share the gospel, the good news. To do so, the conversation must offer something new. It must introduce an element that wasn't there before. It must offer precise, potent, powerful, new information, new insight that was not previously available. This newness, this emergent information introduces a new element which creates a new possibility for intimacy, a new possibility for transformation, a deepening for evolution. The first form of conversation is for the sake of intimacy. We might call that intimate conversation. The second form of conversation is for the sake of evolution. We might call that evolutionary conversation.
Whoa. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Dr. Marc Gafni. We went into a lot of different vectors there. It's a lot of information to sit with, so give yourself some time to digest. But I would like to take this moment to tell you that we do these type of live teachings every single Sunday, and you can join for free by signing up for the free section of our community called World Philosophy and Religion Academy. Completely free tier where you can join these teachings every single week and get all the replays. Enjoy them at any time. come on in. It's absolutely free, and we can start to hang out and do cool stuff by connecting through this amazing gift of technology. So I hope you're doing well wherever you're at on the planet, and I hope that you can find more peace within the paradox of life, find yourself in a deeper state of love and conversation throughout these next days, weeks, and years. Sending you blessings, all the best, and until the next time, so long.